in a conspiracy to distribute narcotics, as well as a conspiracy to possess firearms in furtherance of their drug trafficking business. The indictment also charges in 8 separate counts individual members and associates of CCC with possessing firearms and with possessing narcotics with intent to distribute. I would note that the indictment also contains a forfeiture allegations where we are seeking to forfeit the 15 firearms that law enforcement seized over the course of this investigation, as well as the hundreds of rounds of ammunition that was seized. Yesterday, law enforcement took into custody 3 of the defendants on this indictment: Dayon Jeter, Michael Chester, and Darian Coleman. As of now, 14 of the 15 defendants on that indictment are in custody. Gary Creek is scheduled to surrender later today and have his initial appearance, at which we will be seeking detention. As detailed in the indictment, this gang's enterprise relied on extreme violence to control their territory, to support their drug business, and to intimidate witnesses to prevent them from cooperating with law enforcement. The leadership of this gang, Gary Creek, Corey Cawthorn, and Daryl Carter, essentially ran an organized crime business. This business was illegal, making money through drug dealing, carjackings, and robberies. This business was built on violence, murders and shootings of rival gang members and drug dealers, a contract killing in exchange for money, and intimidation to prevent witnesses from cooperating. Spent time on branding, promoting CCC through clothing, jewelry, and rap songs. And they used social media to locate rivals and victims and to communicate with each other to plan their criminal activity. Now, make no mistake, as alleged in this indictment, CCC was as organized and savvy as they are violent and relentless. This indictment is the product of terrific investigative work by the Baltimore Police Department and by the ATF. Now, since this is a pending matter, we can't get into a lot of detail about the investigation, but we can share that it began with the Baltimore Police Department focusing on violent areas of East Baltimore, including Darley Park and Orchard Ridge. ATF joined the investigation, and the 2 agencies collaborated to put together a thorough and complete investigation that resulted in this 47-page indictment that we unsealed late yesterday. We initially brought an indictment in January of 2019 charging a narcotics conspiracy. And then in December 2019, we superseded that indictment and added additional defendants, including Gary Creek. Some of the defendants in those initial drug indictments have since pleaded guilty. Since the investigation was still ongoing, including investigating those historical homicides and non-fatal shootings that are charged in this new indictment, we did not publicize those earlier indictments. So today is the first time that we are speaking publicly about the CCC investigation. Over 2020 and into 2021, we continued the investigation. And ATF and the Baltimore Police Department deserve significant credit for developing evidence on these historical homicides and non-fatal shootings. The overt acts of the RICO conspiracy that are detailed over 14 pages of this new indictment allege more than 40 specific murders and attempted murders. Now, those are high numbers to be sure, even in the violent year that we are having, unfortunately. But we should keep in mind that these shootings are more than just numbers. For every homicide, there is a victim whose family will never see that person again. And for every survivor of a non-fatal shooting, that is a person who will never be the same, either physically or emotionally. Each of these shootings involves a victim and sometimes multiple victims. The indictment alleges an overt act in March of 2020 where 9 individuals were injured in one shooting by CCC. I would like to conclude with a few points. First, this case illustrates one component of our violent crime strategy, where we use data to identify the most violent areas of the city and then use our law enforcement partner teams to target those individuals driving the violence. These are proactive long-term investigations intended to dismantle violent gangs in Baltimore. Now, as we've seen, these cases can take a long time, which is why last week we announced the expansion of the Exile Gun Prosecution Unit. And those cases take a relatively shorter period of time. So it is our hope that both of those components, the combination of them, the longer proactive investigations with the relatively quicker gun prosecutions, will hopefully help address the violence we are seeing in Baltimore. Second, this indictment reflects another component of our violent crime strategy, which is charging violent drug trafficking organizations and then working back to solve historical homicides and non-fatal shootings. Third, this case against CCC is a good example of how the Baltimore Police Department and our federal law enforcement partners, in this case ATF, can work together to address violent gangs who are perpetrating patterns of violence throughout the city. And finally, I note that many of the defendants charged in this CCC indictment were under the age of 25 at the time that they participated in this violent racketeering conspiracy. It is distressing to all of us that there are so many young people engaging in violence in Baltimore. The indictment alleges a staggering amount of violence, more than 40 combined murders and non-fatal shootings committed by a street-level gang of relatively young people. This case reflects the frequency and the volume of the violence we are seeing, but fortunately, this case also reflects the dedication, the persistence, and the creativity of the Baltimore Police Department and the ATF in going after that violence. The message should be clear that we will not forget and we will never cease to go after the violence in Baltimore. I would like to take a moment to thank Commissioner Harrison and the men and women of the Baltimore Police Department for their terrific work on this case. I'd like to thank Special Agent in Charge Tim Jones and the men and women of ATF for their terrific work on this case. I would also like to thank the FBI and the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, both of who also assisted in the investigation. And I'd like to thank AUSA Patty McLean and the members of our office who handled this matter. At this point, I will now turn it over to Commissioner Michael Harrison.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank our U.S. Attorney Linzer and then recognize and thank Special Agent in Charge of ATF's Baltimore Field Office, Special Agent Tim Jones. When an indictment such as this occurs in an organization that is responsible for mass violence and drug distribution throughout our city is dismantled, I have to thank everyone involved, our federal and state partners, and certainly the men and women of the Baltimore Police Department. Without your dedication and tenacity to holding accountable those responsible for the violence in our city, our success could not be realized. This organization is a classic example of those that perpetrate a culture of violence in our city and a culture of fear and intimidation. It is organizations and criminals such as those affiliated with CCC that continue to fuel violence, fuel intimidation and drug activity that we experience every day in our city. The members not only terrorized entire communities in Baltimore, but were responsible for killing, shooting, and intimidating those wishing to provide information to law enforcement. So let me be clear. We will remain committed to identifying these organizations and their members and associates, as well as removing them from our communities. And our work is not finished. If you make the decision to engage in this type of criminal behavior, we will utilize every resource and bring the full weight of our local, state, and federal government to find and remove you from our communities. I'm proud of the work that was done by everyone involved, to include over 50 law enforcement agents, to remove these violent offenders from our streets. And again, I want to thank all of our partners and the men and women of the Baltimore Police Department as we all work together to make a safer Baltimore. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now hear from Special Agent in Charge Tim Jones.
Thank you, sirs, for the opportunity to speak today. This indictment is an example of the partnerships, intelligence, and enforcement that is needed to prosecute the individuals who continue to bring violence to Baltimore City. This level of violence is unacceptable and has no place here. ATF is honored to work hand in hand with the homicide detectives from the Baltimore Police Department to leave no stone unturned while reviewing mountains of data and other intelligence to obtain the evidence needed for this indictment. The team worked tirelessly with the prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office to ensure the thresholds were met to arrest these defendants. The success of this team effort should serve as a notice to those that choose to commit intolerable and callous acts of violence. Nothing is more serious and heinous than taking the life of another, and we will never stop in our mission to seek justice for all the victims of violence. Now, we know that the community wants to see the outcome of law enforcement's investigative efforts and initiatives. These successes are things we want to share with you as well, and it is our sincere hope that these indictments are an example for the citizens of Baltimore, that even if you are not seeing a release, tweet, or post from us every day, you can be rest assured that there is still crucial hard work happening constantly to reduce violent crime in Baltimore City. Thank you.
The Commissioner has to move on to another event. So thank you very much, Commissioner Harrison, for being here. Appreciate your service. We have time for maybe one or two questions on any topic at all. Yes.
Would you speak to the broader picture of Baltimore's gang problem, the drugs, the gun violence, and how much this puts a dent in that?
This Triple C gang was involved in drug dealing. They were involved in shootings and murders of rival gang members. They were involved in carjackings and robberies, everything from commercial robberies to robbing street dice games. The amount of criminal activity perpetrated by one gang is pretty staggering and alarming. It is unfortunately not atypical. We have a number of loosely affiliated street gangs operating in Baltimore who are committing that range of violence and robberies throughout the city. Now, I would note that it's rare to have an indictment that contains allegations of 18 murders and 27 non-fatal shootings. That is pretty significant. But the type of conduct perpetrated by this gang throughout the city is unfortunately somewhat typical with what we're seeing generally across the city.
The Train to Go case from a couple years ago had quite a number of murders. This has 50% more than that. Is this the largest such indictment that you guys are aware of? I'm not aware of one.
You know, Justin, that's a good question. I don't know that we've done that analysis yet, but certainly anecdotally, Special Agent in Charge Jones, Commissioner Harrison, and I were talking before this press conference, and it certainly is the indictment that has the most number of homicides and non-fatal shootings that we can remember in recent history.
Is there a concern that other leaders will just come up? You mentioned that there was 4 leaders on this list, but is there a concern that there will be others to fill that spot in that Triple C gang role?
You know, that's a great question. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make sure that our enforcement efforts in Baltimore are impactful. And that's a common problem where we arrest members of a gang, take them out of that neighborhood, and then others fill that void. To address that, we are working with the Baltimore Police Department, the city, Mayor Brandon Scott, and the State's Attorney's Office on an initiative to focus city resources on neighborhoods following a big takedown. And that's something that we're hoping to be able to put into place in coming weeks. But yes, that is a concern we have. And when you have an investigation like this, which takes time, you know, we have, in this case, 3 different indictments. This is the first one that we're announcing. So certainly, that is a concern, and, but it's something that the ATF and our office and BPD are focusing on moving forward.
You mentioned the investigation started in East Baltimore. Is that really where the whole focus was throughout the investigation, or how much did it spread throughout the entire city?
Do you want to answer that? What I can say is that the investigation started focusing on a couple of specific areas in East Baltimore, Darley Park and Orchard Ridge, on violence that was perpetrated in those areas. And that's one of the components of our violent crime strategy, which is to use all the data available to all of our law enforcement partners to figure out where can we focus our limited resources. And so BPD identified those specific neighborhoods in East Baltimore. ATF joined the investigation, and there were tactics such as surveillance, video and physical surveillance, undercover drug buys, and other tactics like that to build the case and to the point we could bring the first indictment in January 2019. So there were other acts of violence. If you read the indictment, I know it's long, but you'll see other addresses listed in the overt acts where crimes occurred that were not in East Baltimore. And so that's, you know, sometimes you may have, for example, I believe in this indictment, a situation where members of the CCC went to a different part of the city for a retaliatory shooting or something like that. But the bulk of the drug dealing and activity was in East Baltimore.
And if I can add, that's where NIBIN is so important, because at the end of the day, we're tracking the violence. Geography is an important component, but we want to address the target, those offenders that are committing these acts of violence. So by linking those shootings, by utilizing NIBIN, we can track them all over the city or outside the state or wherever they may go to continue these acts that they commit.
You said 15 guns were seized in this. Where did those guns come from? Are these people the ones bringing them into the city?
So the indictment talks about 15 guns being seized. And I think each of the overt acts talks about specific firearms that were used to commit crimes. And then as Special Agent in Charge Jones just mentioned, with that, they use NIBIN to link up the guns with different shootings. And I think there are some examples of that specified in the indictment. My understanding is that this gang held on to firearms. They shared the firearms. It was almost a requirement of this gang to possess and use firearms. You know, where those firearms came from originally, I don't know that we are in a position at this point of the investigation and prosecution to go into that level of detail.
And again, if I can add, as far as the recovery of the firearms are concerned, each one of them would be submitted in E-Trace so we can determine the source location of that firearm. Those are active and ongoing investigations at this time, but we are following up with each one of them.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your time today. I also want to thank Marcy Murphy, our press officer here, for she spends a lot of time trying to make sure we get information out to all of you. So thank you all for being here today.